Okay, I'm Deborah Cohen. I'm investigations editor of the BMJ, and my day job involves knowing about stats, reporting on stats, but also being sceptical. And rather than kind of teach you about confidence intervals and p-values and odds ratios and hazard ratios or whatever else you want to talk about in terms of medical science, which obviously influence how you report stuff, we can mention it. So if anyone's got any questions throughout, do raise your hand. What we thought we'd do was teach you how to be, or talk to you, teach you, it's interactive, how to be sceptical about research papers, what you're looking for, pitfalls, things to consider. Sure you're aware you get a feed of press releases from medical journals and science-related publications. But there are certain things that you need to look out for. So what we're going to do is discuss kind of how to be sceptical, what to look out for, and potentially how to spot a scoop. And if you've got any questions at any point, raise your hand. Like to make it interactive. If Ivan is going to be who I'll introduce in a minute, is going to be leading on the talk. But if there's any questions at any point, raise your hand. Try to make it interactive. And if you want to know about p-values, confidence intervals, hazard ratios, odds ratios, and any other kind of statistical test that you might want to know about, Ben Goldacre's here later. So anyway, so I'm going to introduce Ivan Oransky, and he's the Vice President and Global Editorial Director of MedPage Today. And speaking as someone that works within the medical profession, this is kind of one of the Bibles of news and skepticism for medical professionals. It's based in the US mainly. And he's also the co-founder of Retraction Watch, which is a great source of stories, which documents and talks a bit about the background of papers that are retracted, scientific papers. So I'm going to hand over to Ivan.
Thanks, Deb, and thanks to the UKCSJ for the ABSW for flying me here. It's always a pleasure to be in the place where we were from, I guess, as a former colony, even though my people are not actually from here. So as Deb mentioned, we both would really like this to be very interactive. So I'm going to go through some things, and some of them are anecdotes and just different studies to look at. Please stop me as you have questions, and if I don't get to most of the slides that I have here, that's actually probably a good thing. It means we're sort of engaged with the subject. But I did want to start just because I happened to pick this up during the coffee break. This is from The Gist, which is someone here from Glasgow. Is that, I don't know if anyone's in the room, but this is a student magazine from students at Glasgow something or other. Pardon my Americanness, I'll just rely on that. I don't know where it is in Glasgow, but a medical student at the University of Glasgow, here it is, named Rob Hallam. He's talking about the sort of issues with medical science reporting. What is wrong with medical science reporting? Which is a nice SEO-friendly headline, to write. It'll get a lot of people to click, so I'll tweet it later. But how can this problem be fixed? One way would be for newspapers to employ very specialized journalists and give them free rein to investigate a topic without constraints over time or resource. While we're wishing, I'd like a pony. So I think that's a good way to set the stage a little bit and hopefully reassure everyone when you look at studies, it is the rare person. You actually happen to be in the room with two of them who really get the time and space to do what they want. Or in my case, I suppose I give my staff the time and space to do what they want. I'm not reporting on a day-to-day basis. But what I'd like to do here is to leave you with the sense that there are a lot of things you can do quickly and very effectively when you're reading studies to try and understand really what's wrong with them. And I think that any scientist, any researcher who tells you that there's nothing wrong with their study, that this is the final word, I'll be a little bit blunt here, should probably have his or her degree revoked, because that's not how science works. It's not how things actually work in science. So, and I did pick, I will admit, a couple of I don't know how I'd characterize them, cheeky. Would that's sort of the right use of cheeky around here? Sort of cheeky examples to just go through here. So here's a study that that appeared in PLOS One. The title, the relationship between anogenital distance, fatherhood, and fertility in adult men. Sort of, you could shorthand that as crotch length and fertility. It was done, it was peer-reviewed and all of that. The fact that the last author's name is Lipschultz should give no one pause. It was not an April Fool's joke. So healthnewsreview.org, which I hope you're all familiar with, and if you're not, please bookmark it. Sadly, Gary Schweitzer, who runs the site, no longer has any funding, and so they no longer actually review stories as they come out. And if anyone has, the few $100,000 a year that he would need to continue doing that, you can see me, and I'd be happy to make a match. But there are other organizations like this around the world. There's one in Australia, Media Doctor, I think is the name of it, Germany, I think 7 or 8 of them around the world that are either patterned on or H&R was patterned on. So they review all these stories, and you can see the entire archive and see how the media has actually covered particular stories. So here's one that he did, a review of this particular study and whether or not it's worth covering. Of course, he had a he likes his puns, which you'll see actually in a minute when I refer to another one. But grabbing eyeballs by putting crotch length, dictated editorial judgment. It fell short in delivering the goods that a man would need in order to evaluate the potential of this finding. And what I want to sort of draw your attention to, and I'm going to do that in a couple different cases here, is that things that you would look for in order to sort of put caveats around a story, in order to describe the nuances around something and explain that in fact this may suggest something, but it doesn't necessarily really mean what the headline might say, it's right in the study. Now this is sort of a little bit of technical language, but this is right from the study itself. So the study says certain limitations weren't mentioned. If you do, and some of them are actually quite funny when you look at it. I see someone laughing at reading them. This was a referral center for male infertility. I mean, that should set off alarm bells that if you're trying to study, sort of compare men with a particular length of anogenital, I mean, this is crazy, but crotch length, and your only group that you're studying are men who are at, a fertility clinic, well, that might suggest they're not entirely sort of the general population, et cetera. It goes on and on here. But the point I want to make, and I'm going to make this in a few different slides coming up, is it's all right there, okay? You don't have to do the silly thing that Deb and I did, which is actually go to medical school in order to read these studies, in order to learn how to read them. And I always say, and Deb, please correct me here if you feel differently, but I always said I didn't actually learn how to read medical studies in medical school. They sort of threw some statistics courses at us, but I slept through them the way I slept through everything, which is why I'm not qualified as a doctor, but among other reasons. But the point being, when I actually learned how to do this was as a member of the Association of Healthcare Journalists. I would go to conference, I would learn from people like Gary, I would practice it, I would get some things wrong and learn from those mistakes. And so you really, you can do this very quickly. Looking at this.
I'll just point out, I mean, in statistical terms, and if we're going to talk kind of fancy statistical terms, that's what you call selection bias. So the population in your study might influence the outcomes, and therefore that might lead to something called external validity. So how valid are those results to the general population? So if you kind of want the geeky kind of science terms, that's what that kind of demonstrates. Sorry.
Yeah, no, not at all. That's an excellent point. And by the way, again, not to say that you have to learn all these terms, but it doesn't hurt to pick up a few of them, because what I always find is that when you're talking to researchers and you can throw a little bit of their language into the conversation, as long as you don't insist on using it yourself for the general public, which can be kind of messy, it helps them sort of, at the very least, it reminds them that you take these things seriously, and it might even suggest that you are smarter than the sort of average bear, which, I'm sure is true because you're all here and you made the excellent decision to come to this session. So again, this is just more of the same, but it's all right there from this study, and I'd urge you to keep looking. Which is, again, another reminder, and I'll probably say this many times, but I never get tired of it. You really shouldn't be reporting on a study. There was a press release about this study. You really oughtn't be reporting on the study if you don't have the entire study, and I would even argue have read the entire study and maybe we can discuss how to get those later. I'll talk about that a little bit. Here's another one, a fist bump. We're all, of course, very concerned about infections and about, cleanliness and all of this, and there are all sorts of theories about what should happen, what shouldn't happen. This guy pictured here, by the way, if you want a sort of skeptical take on lots of things, he's very much worth following. I happen to know who he is, but he's a retired surgeon who goes by the nom de Twitter. Is that right? Nom de something or other. The pseudonym of Skeptical Scalpel. So on Twitter, I think he's Skeptic Scalpel because Skeptical Scalpel doesn't fit. But he's Skeptic Scalpel, and his blog is Skeptical Scalpel, I think at blogspot.com. Sorry?
American spelling. Skeptical.
It is the correct spelling. Is that what you're trying to say? Yes. I'm sorry. Okay. Yeah, it is the, yes. Skeptical with a K, that's correct. Thank you. So I just find him quite something, actually, worth the read. But here he did something about this study that came out. Again, here's his quote. Is this just one of many examples of the media sensationalizing the findings of a paper far beyond what is due? And here's the study. So again, I want to, again, emphasize, these are coming from real studies, peer-reviewed literature, this is not a particularly high-ranked journal. I think there's someone from Elsevier in the audience. I'm sorry to have to remind everyone that not everything Elsevier publishes is highly ranked, but the point is it's a perfectly reasonable journal. It's worth paying attention to. But even right in this study, okay, which again you can see, and by the way, I'm not sure if that's an English or British or American spelling, but I think versus should be probably VERSUS, but I hadn't seen that before. Sorry, I'm copying editing. Maybe that's the Australian. I don't know what exactly. So again, right here in the study, being very upfront about it, the researchers being very upfront. This was a pilot. Okay. Now, when you're in a plane, the pilot is the most important person in the plane, arguably. I mean, unless you really need a drink, I guess that's something else. But a pilot study means that it's just the beginning. It's just taking a look at something. I would ask, should you really cover it? But I'm not going to tell you whether to cover it or not. But if you do, put it in context. Put in context the fact that this is a pilot. But there's something even sort of stronger in here, which is this study is limited by our small sample size, and it could not assess statistical significance. And now, again, if there are questions about particular aspects of statistical significance, we could certainly go into that, and Deb is probably
Does everyone understand what statistical significance means? Does anyone kind of do you want a quick explanation?
As I tell my journalism students at NYU, there are no dumb questions, because if you don't ask the question you think is dumb, you will look dumb to your readers and your editor. But if everyone's comfortable with statistical significance.
I think there were a couple of people that wanted a very
brief so what this, again, I'm going to always turn to Deb to correct me when I get things wrong here, but essentially what this means is these results, is this sort of a real finding, or was this potentially or likely due to chance? Okay, and so all they found here is they have some data, they published it, that's fine, I have no issue with that. But they couldn't actually tell whether the difference they saw between fist bumping and shaking hands was due to chance or not. Well, we've all seen studies like that, some of them actually with huge public health implications, that actually it was probably due to chance. Yeah, correlation is not causation. And so, go ahead, Deb.
And there's another quick point there, and it's called power.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what you talk about. You talk about the sample size. So you potentially need so many people or an event to happen so often, and you do what's called a power calculation. So before you do a scientific experiment in healthcare, you try to establish how many people you will need to detect an event with confidence. And that will then play into the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. And that's when I do my job, when you see potential harms in studies that perhaps haven't come up in a trial, it's possibly because it wasn't adequately powered, so the sample size wasn't big enough to detect a particular event or a particular occurrence of something. Sorry.
No, absolutely. If I get to it, I'll sort of remind you all of that if a study, especially a sort of alleged clinical study like this, doesn't include somewhere in it, usually in materials and methods, the power calculation, and I don't know actually, maybe Deb actually knows how to do a power calculation. I don't know how to actually do one, but I do know what it means, and I do know what it means if the study doesn't include one. So depending what software you're using, you can basically Control F, do a search for the word power. And if you're in a clinical study and that doesn't give you any hits, I would at the very least, I would probably run away, but I would at the very least ask the authors about that. Here's another one that Gary reviewed, walnuts and diabetes. Again, he does like his puns. The story barely cracked the shell on this topic. He probably uses that for study of eggs too, because he likes those. But this is an observational study, and I think that that's worth mentioning. Actually, all the ones that we've looked at are observational. But the distinction between an observational study, where you're essentially just sort of watching what people do and what happens to people who have certain characteristics, whether it's, it may be a gene that they have, but it also may be just what they like to drink or what they tell you they drink. One of the things they taught me in medical school was if you ask someone sort of how often do you do something that is a bad behavior, whatever they tell you, you double it. So, how much do you smoke, sir? A few cigarettes a day. Well, that's 12 packs a week, yeah. And if you ask them how often they do something that is considered a sort of healthy behavior, then you can have it. So, do you go to the gym? How often do you go to the gym? 7 or 8 times a week. That wouldn't be able to find a gym on with Google Maps. Sort of as a response to that. So, an observational study as opposed to a randomized controlled clinical trial. Now. Deb, certainly more than I can even, I think, can talk about some of the limitations of some of these randomized controlled clinical trials, but they are, for good reason, the gold standard, and they really, it's where you're controlling for all sorts of things. You're actually, in this case, controlling for people eating walnuts or not, because if you were to do this study as an RCT, you would actually give people, you give 1,000 people walnuts, and maybe in different doses. You'd give 1,000 people, 1,000 other people, something that looked and tasted and felt a lot like walnuts, but actually wasn't walnuts, because it would be sort of the walnut placebo. I mean, I'm being ridiculous intentionally there. But this was an observational study. And so, again, here's the study, the Nutritional Epidemiology, the Journal of Nutrition. This is a pretty major group, by the way. This is a group at Harvard. And Walter Willett, who's arguably kind of the top researcher in nutrition research, again, doesn't get everything right, but arguably that. But again, right here in this study, our study has several potential limitations. You can usually do that same search you would do for power for the word limitation and find something. Primarily consisted of white female nurses. Again, I mean, are nurses more or less healthy than the average person? I don't know, but they aren't representative of the entire population. I mean, the white female part is clearly not representative of large swaths of the population. Also, people didn't sort of take every nut that they ate and extract it from every candy bar that they ate and put it into a dish and measure it and send your iPhone didn't then send a note. You'd basically ask people how much, I eat, well, this is the U.S., so they must have said ounces, but how many walnuts did you eat this week? And they guessed. And so that's another issue. Again, and this is probably the most important to keep in mind whenever you're looking at an observational study. People who report doing healthy things either likely do more healthy things than the average person, other than the thing you're asking about, or they want you to think they do, which has its own problems. But again, it's hard to, and trust me, I've tried, it's hard to eat a cheeseburger and drink 3 beers while you're on the treadmill. I've been very successful at 2 of those things, as you can tell, and the other one not so much. So, people who do all these things, you don't smoke in a gym generally. I mean, I don't know, maybe there's some weird thing where you do that. But so observational studies can only look at certain things. And this isn't, strictly speaking, a statistical question, but it's very much a study design question that you always want to keep in mind.
Very quickly, that's called confounding. So you might see certain results, Because what you do in a clinical trial is you try and match people, you try and match the group. So you've got two different arms, say for example, one people taking treatment, one people taking placebo, and you'll try and match them, whether it's age, whether it's sex, whether it's all these different things. And there'll be other things in your lifestyle, like going to the gym, and that might be one reason you're seeing the outcomes you're seeing in this study, and we call that in stats and in methodology confounding.
Yep. And again, these terms they're good. Don't get yourself sort of tied into knots about them, but they're good to sort of at least know, and so that when researchers use them, you know what they are at the very least. Here's another one. I haven't been at Reuters for about a year now. I used to run Reuters Health in New York, and so I can sort of say this without fear of getting fired. But this was actually I would probably go as far as to say that the way we covered this story, and I should black out the woman's name, because the freelancer's name, because it was my fault. I ran the show. But the way we covered this story was probably a bit of a mistake. I think we weren't skeptical enough on this, so I hope that that's reassuring, that we can all make these mistakes but learn from them. So here's a study, morning sickness and IQ, morning sickness tied to higher child IQ. Now if you, oops, I don't want to give away the answer because I'm going to ask you to think about this for a second. I mean, this is actually sort of awful in some ways, right? Because you're sort of saying to women who are pregnant, who are thinking of becoming pregnant, or who were pregnant, maybe even worse, if you had just suffered a little bit more during your pregnancy, your kid would be smarter. I mean, that's sort of, and certainly coming, from this morning's, the really important discussion on sexism in science journals. I mean, this is a pretty awful message to send. If there's some validity to it, then we should sort of talk about it. But if you think about this for a second, and again, we've sort of hinted at the answer in terms of the confounders and what have you. This was done by survey, right? So again, this was not women videotaped every morning and sort of someone carefully counted the amount of times that they had they had vomited or they had morning sickness and then sort of correlated it with their children's IQ. IQ, of course, is another minefield. But no, it's women, after the pregnancy, they were asked, well, and at some point, long enough past the pregnancy that there was an IQ score for their children. How do you remember having morning sickness, and if so, how often? And there was allegedly a dose-response relationship, meaning that the more morning sickness they had, the smarter their children were. I mean, this was sort of just wow, you can see why we were tempted to cover this and did cover it. But can anyone think of a sort of, in the way that Deb was saying, a confounder that might, make that a little bit strange? What's that?
The intelligence of the mother.
Yeah, so what are you testing when you're testing IQ? One of the things is memory. So mothers of children with higher IQs remember things better because they probably have higher IQs, quite frankly. And, I mean, again, I don't want to get into an IQ discussion. That could take us to the next 6 years. But the point is there's something there if you're looking at this with any validity at all. Well, guess what? It was right in the study. I bolded that myself. That wasn't bolded in the study, but it's right there. And I'll be honest, we really glossed over that at best. That's probably even being charitable. Probably had I sat and thought about this longer, this was like I think I was at Reuters for about like 2.5 weeks by the time when this came out, and I was probably not paying enough attention yet. I was still figuring out where the men's room was. But I don't know that we would have covered it all, or we would have covered it very skeptically because maybe other outlets would. But recall bias, again, it's a sort of technical term for, this notion of anything that's done by a survey. You have to really take into account what people are more likely to remember. They're more likely to remember sort of bad experiences, like morning sickness. We don't write stories in journalism, for example, 352 planes landed safely at Heathrow today. If there's a near miss or even an accident, we cover that. So just to say to you, and in case I sometimes when I try and give this message to journalists, they say, well, it's hard to find these things and what have you. That may have been the case at some point. It's not the case now. Here's another study, which of course has limitations itself, to be a little bit meta, but this basically found that they looked at 300 medical research papers, 73% to acknowledge a mean of 3 limitations, and actually most of them acknowledged something or another. But here's something where they actually acknowledged at least 3. So they're there. And in one journal, Annals of Internal Medicine, I don't think you can quite read that, but what's circled there is right in the abstract. I mean, I love this is the sort of thing I geek out on. I really get excited about when a journal does this. Right in the abstract. I mean, for a reporter or anyone to miss this means they didn't even read the abstract, which at that point just says, I'm not going to read your stories anymore. But potential biases, blah, blah, blah. So it's right there. And then they, of course, go into it in more detail in this study. But let me sort of remind you that they are not in press releases. You will not find the limitations in press releases. I know we have some press officers here, and I don't mean to pick on anyone. I sort of pick equally on everyone, I think. But press releases, and by the way, and certainly if you know Deb's work at all, you know that you should not be surprised that companies, that drug makers or device manufacturers don't include limitations in press releases. But actually, it's worse than that. This was a study by Steve Woloshin and Lisa Schwartz. They're terrific. They're at Dartmouth, and they do a lot of really important work in a number of areas, really scrutinizing the press and saying some uncomfortable but true things. Here, they turned the lens sort of around a little bit and looked at press releases from academic medical centers. Now, academic medical centers, they're supposed to be the places we trust. They're universities. They're about the truth. I won't bore you with all the details, and by the way, I'll put these slides online. I always do that at SlideShare. But essentially, the message of this is that the studies that they chose to include in press releases, they basically hyped them. I mean, and I don't think that that's overstating the case. They overstated whether they were clinically relevant. They did all sorts of things like that. This was in that journal I like so much, the Annals of Internal Medicine. And in fact, maybe this, I don't know if there's any direct relationship, but this may have led to their decision. I like saying this, so I like putting in a slide of myself saying it. This is, narcissism and egotism all thrown into one. But I've been quoted saying, I think it's journalistic malpractice to not have the full study in front of you in your reporting. So since I went to medical school and malpractice sends a shudder through all of my classmates, I feel like I'm using it with a little bit of honesty and gravitas. But I really do think this. I think that if you're reporting on a study and you don't have it in front of you and you don't read it, you're really committing journalistic malpractice. And I'll talk actually. Some of you may get very tired of hearing my American accent by the end of the day, because I'm doing a few other sessions. And in the last one today, which Deb is also on, I'll talk a little bit about why that's a problem and why we maybe shouldn't rely so much on studies. But that's for another discussion. Again, I'll put these online, so don't worry about all this stuff. But and in fact, again, Elsevier's here, and they give any reporter who comes calling, as far as I know, at least that's what Tom Reller, who I work with a lot there, has told me. Anyone who wants access as a reporter can get access to all the journals. But AHCJ, sort of plug for my organization in the States, I'm the vice president of the Association of Healthcare Journalists. We have some members here in the UK, and actually would always love to have more. Be happy to talk to you about that. But you get access to actually all of those and a number of others that are not listed. Cochrane Library, a tremendously important resource of meta-analyses and systematic reviews, et cetera. And by the way, if you get really stuck, and it's not in any of the, nowhere in that list, but at the bottom there, I've never met a scientist or researcher who won't, if you ask for the PDF, the full access, give it to you. It's just, why wouldn't they give it to you? I mean, actually, if they don't, then you should. That becomes the story. The sort of, well, you're so ashamed of your own work. Did you send it to your mother? Sort of.
Sometimes, though, they tell you that they can't give it to you for copyright reasons because it's under peer review.
Oh, if
Well,
it's under peer review, that's different.
Yeah, I mean, if it's, and I can, unfortunately, because of one of my other obsessions, embargoes, I can wax eloquent about this wonderful thing called the Inglefinger rule, which is kind of, I think, what you're getting at. But I'm really talking about it, a study that's published, and it's published somewhere. It's just maybe behind a paywall, and, can you get access to it? Again, I'm quoting myself, typical American thing to do. But ask dumb questions. I suggested that before, that, there really aren't any. I would so much rather, when I was first starting out, I'll be honest, I used the MD in my sort of tagline to get some interviews that people sort of thought, oh, well, he'll get it right, which is really not something they should have thought at all, and they were wrong half the time. But it got me in the door to a lot of places, but I would get off the phone and realize that I had this notebook full of gibberish, and it was useless. I couldn't make heads or tails of it. And so, you've got to really not be afraid of asking what you might think is a dumb question, but which is actually the smart question. I'm not afraid of that. And don't be afraid of that. Ask whether it was peer-reviewed. Again, we can talk, and we'll talk later today about the peer review. It ain't perfect. It's not really a good housekeeping seal of approval. But it certainly is at least a filter, and we'll talk about that later today in the other session. Where was it published? Again, some journals it's very competitive to get into. The same way for freelancers or for anyone pitching a major news outlet, it's going to be more competitive. Well, the same thing's true if you want to publish in the BMJ. It's much more difficult than it is to publish in the Oransky Journal of cutaneous whatever. It's actually really easy to publish there. Just see me later and write me a check. Yeah.
Actually, that's an interesting question to me. I mean, maybe it doesn't apply to other people, but how do you tell? I mean, everybody's heard of the BMJ, everybody's heard of Nature, but how do you tell in an obscure field that you're not familiar with? Which are the significant journals and which are the ones
Sure.
full of whack research?
I think it's a great question. Deb, you might have some response as well.
One measure is the impact factor,
Yeah.
but I am so sceptical about the impact factor. And that's a whole other debate whatsoever,
Yeah.
where you can game and things like that. But but the other thing, if you're unsure, is ask a specialist in the area. Which journals do you rate
How do you know
in your
who's not
specialty? Well, that's it. I mean, you develop trusted sources, and there's no kind of hard and fast rules. But one simple measure is have a look at the impact factor.
Yeah, and I have to say, I share skepticism about pretty much everything, but and I used to work at Thomson Reuters, and people used to think that when I said you should check the impact factors because somehow, I would get a bonus every time someone did that. I can assure you that was not the case. In fact, I barely spoke to the folks who run that. Impact factor is fairly useless if you just look at it overall. It makes no sense to compare.
Sorry, it's a new one on me. I thought it was something to do with things like crotch length making for good headlines. Where are the impact factors reported?
Yeah, well, a couple of things. So impact factor, what it very simply is a measure of how often papers in that journal are cited within a 2-year period. And it's just a simple math. Thomson Reuters, again, Thomson Scientific, actually, Eugene Garfield years ago created it, and they created a business out of it, and you can look at all of that. It doesn't make very much sense to compare the BMJ's impact factor to, actually even to Nature's. That doesn't make any sense. But within a field, I find it very useful to know what the top 20 journals are in cardiology, in infectious disease, in cancer, et cetera. I do think that that's a useful thing to do. Thomson Scientific stuff is behind a paywall, but you can kind of get around that. Most journals, especially if they have a good impact factor, will trumpet what their impact factor is right on their homepage. And they'll often tell you how it's ranked in different fields. Wikipedia actually has grabbed a lot of that as well. If you're really stuck, I don't mind. I have access to it, and turn off the camera, and I can promise you that I'll try and respond. But other people do too. If you have any kind of academic affiliation, generally universities have a license into Thomson Scientific that can help you as well. But you at least get a sense of it. But again, as Deb says, you talk to the specialist. You have to trust someone. But I do want to get back to this sort of smart questions thing. This is actually a student of mine was working on a story, and it was in a, and I don't want to give away any details. I'm sort of trying to keep her, I mean, she did the right thing here, but just sort of not tell too many details. This was a study that was making clinical claims, but when I looked at where it was in a decidedly non-clinical journal. It was a basic science journal. I mean, that to me is always a red flag. If it really has solid clinical claims, then you would think the authors would want to get it in front of their colleagues who are doing clinical medicine. And that's where they'll try and publish it. And so I sort of spoke to the student, and I said, well, did you ask? I'm just curious how it ended up there. And she actually did, and this is the answer she got. I raise it for a couple of things. One is the answer this researcher gave was nonsense, which sort of gave it away a little bit for me. But the other is that the researcher's like, wow, a reporter who actually understands that there's a hierarchy of journals, that there's sort of a more appropriate place for particular studies, that's going to maybe in the long term create a source for you who's more impressed with you than not. I do think it's worth just mentioning, we can talk all we want about statistics, we can talk all we want about study design, but if the study wasn't in humans, there are vanishingly few conditions for which the animal models are really, really sort of directly translatable. I could list them probably, and maybe Deb has a few more, but kind of on the fingers of one hand. And so I like to say it's remarkable there are any mice left with cancer, depression, or restless leg syndrome. I mean, we've cured these diseases, the last of which is pretty controversial in mice so many times. Why are we still looking at this? Size matters. The size of crotch length apparently matters, so why shouldn't every other kind of size matter? Again, we mentioned this already, but look for that power calculation. If you don't see one, ask about it and ask why it's not there. I won't bore you with details here, and we've kind of touched on some of this. This is a pyramid scheme, but it's the hierarchy of evidence pyramid, and you can probably debate some of this, actually. But overall, this is sort of a more or less agreed upon sort of a hierarchy of evidence. It's from a guide that Gary Schweitzer wrote. Gary runs Health News Review, and I edited it, but it's an Association of Healthcare Journalists. It's free to members. And this just says, look, everyone should sort of decide where on this pyramid they're comfortable starting to report. Ideas, editorials, opinions are like a particular body part that's close to the crotch. Actually, it's sort of in the crotch. Everyone has one, but doesn't make it particularly valuable, okay? I guess that's a sort of a very unrefined American expression, so I won't go further with it. But, that doesn't really require any evidence. And then as you go up, well, you have animal research. We talked about that a second ago. Case reports, case series. Until you're getting up into that sort of case control studies, cohort studies, and again, those are observational. The question really is how much can you draw from this? And how much do you really just want to write stories that basically say, I don't know, it's really about a mechanism. Until you get to that point, you're really talking about a mechanism paper. And that may not be particularly clinically relevant. It may be very interesting scientifically, and you may be writing about it for that reason, which I think is great. But don't make clinical claims based on it. These are a couple questions that, again, require knowing the lingo a little bit. But I think it's worth just talking about what endpoints are. So when you do a clinical trial, you have particular endpoints that you're looking for. If you're doing a study, I'll tweak Deb here because she wants to hear more about statins. But if you're doing a study of statins, was your primary endpoint, what primary endpoint would matter? These are obviously drugs that are supposed to prevent heart attacks and hopefully prevent death. If your primary endpoint was death, because that matters to people generally, and all you're actually reporting in your study was cholesterol levels, for example, which vaguely correlate but actually not so well, then why aren't you reporting the original endpoint, which is the one that matters to people? We're in the midst of the World Cup, and of course, as an American, I have no idea what that means, but allegedly, if you move the goalposts, right, that would be football, our football, whatever. Metaphor is terrible. If you move the goalposts in the midst of the game, then you're going to obviously change, the score. You're going to make it easier or harder for people to score and to have a result in this case. Ask that question. The other thing to keep in mind, we talked briefly about statistical significance. The word significant is actually a great piece that ran a couple days ago, I think, in IO9. I don't know if you guys know IO9, but great piece by Annalee Newitz, and she has I think the title is something like Top 10 Concepts That Scientists Wish You Would Stop Getting Wrong. And, I don't know if significance is on there, I don't remember, but is it? It is, even better. So my semi-jet lag memory is working. Significance, we can all sort of have a comfort level of what significant means. It means important. But it actually has a very specific meaning for, anyone in science, anyone in research. So again, statistically significant, we talked about whether or not it's likely due to chance. Clinically significant is different. That just means, is it likely to make any difference to people? You can show a difference in blood pressure of, say, one millimeter of mercury. And, it's very clear that it's statistically significant. Okay. But at that clinically, unless you look at the sort of entire world and look at averages and things, that isn't going to prevent a stroke or a heart attack, okay, in each person that gets it, that has that lower. So even though it's very robust and very statistically significant, it's not necessarily clinically significant, and that's a really important distinction.
And that brings on something else called a surrogate endpoint. So best example is blood sugar, blood glucose for diabetes. If you lower blood glucose, what you want to try and do as a doctor is try and reduce someone's risk of heart attacks. But what's easy to measure is how much people's blood sugar comes down if you give them a treatment, say insulin or metformin or something like that. But there's big questions, and that's what's touted. It's easy to measure, it's easy to study, you take blood tests. But what you really want to know is how clinically significant that is. How much does that matter to the patient, and does that bringing down that blood sugar actually reduce the risk of heart attacks? And I think the answer is no there. But that is what's been studied, and it's still controversial, but that's often what you find in studies. That endpoint might be something that's statistically significant, but what does it mean in what you're trying to do, or what you're trying to prevent, or what you're trying to change?
When you're studying something like longevity, you've simply got to make do with surrogate endpoints, haven't you? Because people live such a long time. So
Well, unless you're studying worms, which is what
I'm
most...
not saying surrogate
longevity studies
endpoints
in.
are bad.
Some
Yeah.
things like
Yeah.
this.
But sometimes, you have to be cautious on reporting on them. What are you actually trying to say? To in the message that you're trying to convey, that there's sometimes leaps of faith, and that has been done throughout science, where we've measured something as a surrogate, but actually that doesn't quite translate into the endpoint, the primary endpoint we want to actually achieve. So I think it's just, we're getting to real techie stuff here, but again, it's just remembering that what are you trying to say? What is the researcher trying to measure, and what is the clinical significance of what they're trying to measure?
It's also worth noting, the US FDA and other agencies, but I think the FDA sort of took the lead in this, allows for drugs to be approved based on surrogate endpoints in certain conditions. Actually, statins are a good example, because if you're trying to prevent death, you aren't going to, or at least they decided not to, make the companies do a 50-year-long study, for example. And also in other conditions where it's life-threatening, HIV may have been the first. It was, I think, HIV and cancer, where instead of looking at deaths, which can take a long time to sort of suss out, they looked at markers like, in the case of HIV, CD4 counts and T cell counts as well. So, and now they're doing viral load, which is sort of the other endpoint. Something to keep in mind when you're writing about something that is really being press released and everyone's all excited about is this concept of disease mongering. And Americans don't really know what mongering is. It's sort of quaint, I guess, and I think it's a more comfortable word here. But you're basically selling, right? So you're selling disease. There are conferences about this now. A number of people, Ray Moynihan, Adrian Few Berman, Ray's in Australia, Adrian's in Washington in the States, have really seized upon this idea and I think done a lot of important work. PLOS Medicine, 2007, I want to say, had a whole issue on this subject. And the idea is that you are sort of creating a market, that drug companies in particular, and anyone who makes money in healthcare, it could be doctors or whomever else, is creating a market by doing the studies, creating a market by sort of making everyone think they should worry about it. It's controversial, but the restless leg, which I mentioned, that's something. An example of this. Social phobia. This is maybe bigger in the States, but a decade ago, the folks who make, was it Paxil? I think it was Paxil.
Serexat, we know it here. Paroxetine, we know.
Paroxetine, right.
Is the generic, or Serexat is the branded name.
So they sort of realized that they could get approval to treat many, to sort of market this to many, many more people if they got an indication for social phobia. Now, if you look up the definition, and DSM-5 now, which is the next edition, is now, of course, out. But if you look up the older definition of social phobia, I challenge anyone in this room to not have social phobia. I mean, this is the sort of thing, if you were ever, when you were, say, in high school, a little bit sheepish about, asking someone on a date, I'm pretty sure that, actually I know that would actually qualify you to have social phobia. So basically the entire population should be on Paxil, should be on paroxetine. That's sort of a crazy thing, but that's this sort of concept of disease mongering that you really want to watch for. And the best way to just at least put a little bit of a break on that, a little bit of throwing a little bit of a wet blanket on it is just say how many people actually have the disease, or how many people claim, and what your source is for that information. If you look at diabetes, look, millions of, I think it's becoming the case everywhere, but, in the U.S., it's some huge number, tens of millions of people have diabetes. They really do. High blood pressure, I have high blood pressure. I think a third of the U.S. has high blood pressure. It may be a little different in other countries, but that's a real disease that a lot of people have that has real consequences. Social phobia, I'm not so sure. I'll just briefly mention, there are always other angles in stories. Sometimes you can actually still write the piece, and I think this might be, hopefully if you're sitting here looking at me and Deb and saying, but wait a second, I've got to make a living, I've got to write this stuff, I've got to meet today's deadline and tomorrow's deadline. You can still do it. You can still write really smart, interesting pieces, but you don't have to oversell the sort of clinical nature of something or the scientific nature of something. Here's a great example. It was a story, there's a study that ran in the JAMA, one of the journals, one of the JAMA sister, the family of journals. And, it turns out when Tom Averill, who's a great reporter at Philadelphia Inquirer, looked at the author list, he realized that one of the authors was 14 years old, which is pretty impressive, actually. She's not the record holder. The record holder is a 9-year-old who wrote a study in JAMA about 15 years ago debunking something that the world-famous Dr. Oz thought was a really good idea, which always gives me a little bit of a laugh when I see him on TV. But that's another angle to look at. Again, we've really talked about this. I think Deb did a really good job talking about the surrogates and the endpoints. One way to look at it is, a lot of press releases just say, oh, they prevented complications or patients improved. What does that mean? Quantify as much as you can when you're writing. You got to look for those side effects. Gary puts this really well. It's clinical reporting on clinical studies looks like a candy store. Everything's you walk in, everything's wonderful, and you're not going to talk about diabetes in the candy store, but actually, there are side effects to everything. Even water has some side effects. We really have to. You're not going to find those in that press release. Look at those tables. Do a better job. Again, the numbers aren't hard to distinguish there. You don't really need to sort of do a statistical analysis. They kind of have to be there. If they're not, that's problematic.
And this is often, if you're investigating, this is where it's at. There was a recent study last year, and you'll have seen Ben Goldacre cite it everywhere, and I'm sure if he's here later he'll mention it, but it was done by the German equivalent of NICE called IQWiG, and they looked at the data that regulators have on their files in terms of side effects of treatments, and they compared it to what was published. And I can't remember the exact statistic, but it was something like 80% underreporting of adverse events compared to what the companies have on file and the regulators. Obviously, the regulators don't always get the true picture either, and what was published. So again, this is where there's stories and there's often digging needed.
Yeah, I'm going to just flip through these. We're supposed to end at 10 of, but we started a little late. But I just want to get to some questions and things. Maybe obvious, but most journalists don't ask how much something will cost, and they take we're not ready to talk about that yet as a sort of decent response. It isn't one. People don't study things and then sort of decide how much they're going to cost later. Sovaldi, which is this Hep C drug that I don't know what the generic is, but
it's
it's $1,000 pill. This is going to bank. it's going to even further, I should say, bankrupt, the U.S. healthcare system, such as it is. If you can't get an answer out of the researchers, which is often the case, call Wall Street. Call Wall Street analysts who cover that company. They have priced this out, and they know exactly the price at which, the company will make money or not. And I'm not saying that's the right number, but it is the number that the company has projected. And you can at least throw some meat on those bones.
This is where you'll see the Daily Mail flogging no one from the Daily Mail here, flogging the NHS for refusing to pay for drugs that perhaps are too expensive. There's a willingness to pay, then that's what's calculated. And if you try and get that data, it's often commercial in confidence. But there's often negotiations, quite thorny negotiations between the likes of NICE and specialist commissioning groups who purchase kind of rare drugs for rare diseases on behalf of the NHS. And this is where often there's a lot of quite interesting stuff that goes on, actually, if you can find someone to talk to you about it.
Conflicts of interest, I'm sure you're all familiar with that. This is a bit U.S.-centric in terms of the resources, but there are resources around the world like this. ProPublica, which is a great news organization, nonprofit news organization in the U.S., actually got all the data on doctors and how much they had received from different drug companies over the years. It was actually part of a big lawsuit settlement at one point. But you can actually search. This doesn't help UK journalists very much, but anyone in the U.S. can search their doctor and see how much they made. Again, very briefly, always think about alternatives. One of the things we do, especially when we've gotten a press release, it looks very exciting, or at a conference and something looks very exciting, is only report on that. And even if the results are completely true and it's a reasonable study and well done and all that, there's almost certainly an alternative to it. And the alternative may be to do nothing. Maybe this disease doesn't really kill people. The alternative may be a cheap thing like aspirin or an old drug for high blood pressure. There was a big study called AllHat, which came out and showed that drugs that you can give for a nickel a day were just as effective as these new expensive ones. Again, and think about alternative explanations. We talked about, we didn't talk about coffee and pancreatic cancer. We talked about morning sickness and IQ instead. But think about the alternative explanation that isn't about, just mom and having, sort of nasty juice, the baby sort of circulating in nasty juice that's leading to, I'm being obviously silly here, leading to morning sickness. It's something I wrote for Ed Young, but the point here is, do always find those outside sources. We can talk, if you'd like, about how to find them, but I'll get to one particular. I'm going to skip over this. It's again, these slides will be available, but some math that you could do quite easily. I'll leave you with two things. One is that I have a favorite. I'm geeky enough to have a favorite sort of clinical statistic, statistic, and that statistic is known as the NNT. It's the number needed to treat. It's a very elegant way of saying, and it's mathematically actually quite easy. And you can. There's a site called the NNT.com which will walk you through all of this. It's done by this emergency doc, or what do they call them here? A&E? Is that an A&E? But the equivalent in the U.S. Anyway, NNT is a very elegant way of showing how many people actually need to be exposed to something, whether it's a treatment or a toxin or something, a poison, to have the effect. And obviously, the bigger that number, the more people would need to be treated, the bigger the market becomes, and the less effective something is on a case-by-case basis. As the closer you get to one, which you really can't get unless you say water for dehydration or something like that, the better you are. And the final thing I'll leave you with is what's something that's always been my dirty little secret. It's not really a dirty little secret because I tell everyone to do it, I suppose. But keep a biostatistician in your back pocket. You're all in a country that has plenty of wonderful universities, most of whom will have biostatistics departments. They might call them epidemiology departments. They might just be in a math department. I don't know. But find someone who can, this is what, this person sort of gets off on, is ripping apart studies. I mean, I get off on it too, but this is someone who's actually paid to do it and qualified to do it. They will be your best friend. You take them to lunch once in every whatever. Biostatisticians are somewhat lonely people. Okay, if you imagine having biostatistician on your business card, if you give it to people at cocktail parties, you probably don't get all that many calls. Well, be the person who calls that person and takes him or her to lunch. And they're great. And again, they will rip into statistics and in ways that I certainly can't, in ways that you sort of wouldn't think of, and really make your studies much smarter. And sometimes you quote them, and sometimes you just sort of have them as background. But I find them really useful. So that's that. And why don't we, I guess, take questions as long as people.
Any questions? I mean, obviously, it's a massive kind of huge subject area. Books have been written on it, but are there any specific questions anyone has, or anything else anyone would like to know?
Just wonder if you could talk a bit about subgroup analysis and how that can throw up significant results just by doing the same test over again.
Gosh.
Look, my mic's not working.
Well, if you think about when you're setting up a study, you're pre-specifying your group, aren't you? You've got a protocol, you follow a protocol, and that's what you do. Subgroup analysis is when you choose out of that study, you choose a particular subgroup that you've studied in a clinical trial. So let's say we decide to randomise drinking water throughout the day to not drinking water throughout the day to see how hydrated somebody is, and we randomly assign you to each of those groups. And there'll be a mix of men and women of different age groups in that trial. We then want to know specifically how women fare. So we're picking women from those two different groups. And that's basically what's called a subgroup analysis. So you're picking a subgroup within that particular study. And there are all sorts of ways to game. It all comes down to gaming. We'll touch on a bit of this at the last section. So you can pick whatever subgroup that you kind of want to pick, potentially, to come up with a particular result, because you're not necessarily pre-specifying. The whole point of doing clinical trials, you're pre-specifying with a protocol how you're going to do that study. With a subgroup analysis, you're not necessarily always pre-specifying who those people are, and there's the risk of bias and a risk of cherry-picking a particular subgroup. On the other hand, they can be very, very well done. So, I mean, it's a whole kind of, and I'm not an epidemiologist, I kind of know enough to get me through the day job. But, I mean, there are all sorts of ways of kind of gaming a particular subgroup and cherry-picking what you want to see and who you include. And always remember, when you're looking at studies, what the inclusion criteria are, so who the people are picked. Because, again, trials can be gamed about who you include in that study, who's left out, who drops out. And I've briefly mentioned dropouts. That's incredibly important. I did a piece, interviewed someone who is an insider at the Food and Drugs Administration in the States who looks at clinical trials day to day, and his view is dropouts from clinical trials are getting bigger. It might be because the big clinical trials are getting bigger, but percentage-wise they're getting bigger. And there's potentially all sorts of stories why people might drop out of trials.
The only thing I would add to that, because I think that's exactly the way to think about these things, is if you go back to the discussion of power, as you get smaller and smaller, number one, it becomes more and more difficult to actually have enough statistical power particularly for a small group. And the other is that if it wasn't pre-specified, they may not have calculated the power. They may not have actually tried to figure out how many people you'd need in that arm of the study. And so, if it is an arm of the study, and so you're going to end up with sort of a fairly meaningless result.
Hi. When it comes to small studies, at what point do you think small studies can be valid? I'm thinking particularly about things like MRI studies, where you're looking at a brain scan and you can see that in these circumstances, particular parts of the brain are lighting up, and in these, because they tend to be quite small studies, and I'm never quite sure at what point you should take those seriously and not.
It goes back again to the power calculation and what you're trying to measure. If you are simply reporting on what you see specifically, and also it depends on how you interpret what you see. So again, go back to the biostatistician. If they haven't actually said, pre-specified, said this is why we've got this sample size, and it's called sample size, and there's another website I think called samplesize.com or something like that, or as an epidemiologist I know who's Twitter meme is sample size or something like that. It's all about sample size and what you're trying to measure. So it might be justifiable if you have a sample size of 7, say, for example. It depends on what you're trying to measure and how you then interpret your findings. And if it's a physiological effect, that's one thing. So if you're saying someone's body behaves in this kind of way, that's one thing. But then if you're trying to extrapolate that to what happens in everyday life, what happens at the bedside if you're a doctor, that's a different story entirely. I mean, story that I did about 2 years ago was on sports drinks. So a lot of the claims, you know, when you see, you know, hydrate me now, this hydrates you better than water. Well, what does that mean? You know, it's a physiological phenomenon. You might absorb something with salt or glucose into the gut better than you do pure water because of kind of ion exchange at the bowel level. But what does that really mean in terms of performance or a particular outcome? Does that turn you into Mo Farah? Can you go and perform longer if you're drinking a sports drink? So again, be careful of what is a physiological claim and then what is kind of much more of a clinical or an outcome claim, like a reduction in mortality or an improvement in performance and stuff like that. So it sounds like it's all kind of language and semantics, and it is to a certain extent, but just keep a kind of critical hat on, I think.
And there's a little bit of a rule of thumb that's worth thinking about with size, with sample size, which is that the more rare a condition is, the smaller sample size you need to show power. Again, at the end of the day, it gets back to power calculation, the way we've been saying. But, you know, there's this disease, this terrible disease called progeria, in which children basically age at an incredibly rapid rate. I mean, they look like, 8-year-olds will look like an 80-year-old. It's quite devastating, and obviously there's a lot of mortality. But it's a very rare disease, and I think in the U.S. there's something like, I want to say 40 children a year born with it. I mean, that may not be the right number, but it's on that order. So, you know, you are not going to have just by common sense, you're not going to have a study of 10,000 children with this. If you have 8 of them, it's sort of the equivalent of having a study of about 4 million people with diabetes, just to pick some fairly random numbers. And so that statistical power is okay. And there's a rule of thumb, you look at the power calculation, but in general, the more common a condition, the more people you'll need.
Hi, I just had a comment about what you said about press officers never including the limitations in a press release. I'm a press officer, and I know from personal experience that I do include the limitations. I've got a science background, and it's important to me that the story is, but the study is covered well in an article. I do think sometimes it can change the way in which you might distribute the press release. You might do a pitch to a specific journalist where they can talk to the academic one-on-one about the limitations. But yeah, I just wanted to stick up for press officers. Yep. I don't think never is the right use. Never is quite a strong term, especially in a talk about statistics. So there we go.
If I'm asking scientists not to overgeneralize, I shouldn't overgeneralize myself. So fair enough.
Hi, yeah. When you're talking about having a statistician, contact, do you use them just to understand the study and the statistics, or do you actually use them as a source that you would quote in a study? That's one of my questions. And second question is about the study with the IQ and morning sickness, for example. What would you do with that now? I mean, a study like that might look interesting and others will report on it. Would you just leave it if you realize it's a bad study, bad design, or would you try and debunk it, cover it in a different way?
Good. Two good questions. As far as using the statistician, I use them both ways. So sometimes I and again, my reporters now more than me, but when I was sort of doing more daily reporting, I would either, I would quote them or just use them as background. It depended on what the study was and what needs I had, but I use them. It's really a source. I just developed them as a relationship with them, and then sort of figured it out from there. In terms of what I might do with morning sickness and IQ now, I probably, if I did that again where I was, I probably just wouldn't have covered it, because the thing about Reuters is the minute you you sort of write about something at Reuters, it's everywhere, and I think that has a certain amount of responsibility that you have to think about, and I've certainly learned from that. Now, what we would probably do is not cover it at MedPage Today, which is for doctors, nurses, et cetera. It's a sophisticated audience when it comes to clinical medicine. I probably wouldn't cover it, but we actually started a column a couple months ago called Hype Watch. As you know, Mitra, I don't know if everyone else knows, I like blogs that have the word watch in them. It's a little weakness of mine. We started something called Hype Watch, and so we'll kind of wait until something we figure will get a lot of attention gets it. And if it doesn't get it, it's nice, we can ignore it. If it gets a lot of attention like this one, let's say that it did, we would then do a column, John Geaver, who does a lot of these for us, is terrific, has a lot of experience. We'll just do a column sort of looking through what it actually showed and say, hey, this isn't what you think it is. And that will often get picked up by bigger outlets. So I wouldn't say that we can exactly kind of, we're not equal to, even with all of that, we're not equal to sort of whatever came out in terms of reach, but it's one way to sort of, make the world a little bit smarter or something like that. Should we go to lunch?
Yeah, and I think the other thing, do be careful of your sources. I can't say this enough, working on a medical journal day to day, grappling constantly with conflicts of interest. It's a real live issue. So that was what I would stress as well. If you're seeking out an epidemiologist or a biostatistician, do ask them about their conflicts of interest. They do have to present it when they go to conferences and stuff, but do make it kind of routine that you ask that, because it genuinely is an issue. I mean, you quote the conflicts of interest at the bottom of all your articles on MedPage Today.
MedPage, we actually put that in every single one.
Yeah, and that's phenomenally helpful when I read something on MedPage. You can kind of read it, it does change how you read stuff. But I would stress, try and do that if you can. We don't do it in the UK nearly enough.
Most conflicts of interest are thought to be considered as financial conflicts of interest, but of course there are also conflicts of interest with politics and faith, various biases like that. So particularly when you're talking about things you do with children, or how you treat the elderly.
Of course. I mean, it was. You look at the kind of a lot of the end of life debate about the Liverpool care pathway, and where that was coming from. That was coming from a group of doctors that have a particular view of physician-assisted suicide and the view of palliative care. So it does affect much more than it is much more than financial conflicts of interest. But if you are reporting on something that's scientific rather than kind of and the thing with medicine is a lot of these kind of personal preferences come in to treatment and ideologies, everything like that, and it is worth and check out the affiliations. It mightn't just be financial, it might be to kind of think tanks and lobby groups, because certainly in medical science, I mean, there's a lot of
the flip side of that, I think, just because we don't want to cut into everyone's lunch break, we'll take one more question. The flip side of that, obviously, financial ones are the easiest nowadays to sort of track and include. Flip side is sometimes people with corporate interests use that argument to say, and certainly not suggesting you're doing that, but use that argument to say, well, since you can't report on all of them, why are you being selective and only including financial ones? And I just sort of, that's a little bit of a shoot the messenger argument. I don't have a lot of truck for that, but maybe last question.
Hi, Chris Grace, freelancer. Just following up on this conflicts of interest point, I just wanted to say I think it's a good note to actually go further in the exploration of the conflicts of interest, because I've seen a lot of reporting where there's just mention of potential conflict associations, and that isn't really so helpful either, because whilst people aren't necessarily perfectly rational beings, I think that it's unfair to ignore an entire perspective just based on a particular association. I think scientists are capable of being rational as well.
So that's not what we're saying, but I mean, there's plenty of, it can go either way, but I do think to say it doesn't influence is kind of ignoring bodies of research that say that, and this has been so well studied. I mean, Ivan goes to something called the Peer Review Congress that, major journals input into, and there were so many studies that have looked into this, because it is something that journal editors tie themselves up in knots about. So to totally disregard it is wrong.
I agree.
But if it's reported, then it's putting things. We're not saying that particular conflict has made someone say that, But I mean, whenever I try and get stories and people that have received payment from a particular company to study a particular drug, and you know the stuff that's going on, it's very hard to actually get them to criticise. But I mean, that's a whole other story, and you know, we've got a kind of whole session at the end that might touch on some of these
That's great.
issues.
I'm just saying take it further. So rather than just simply listing conflicts of interest, actually finding out and exploring with the person, you know, where their beliefs actually lie and how that influences their decision making.
We should be doing that as a good journalist as well, and then
Exactly.
reporting that. Yeah, no, I agree.
Mention our editors and their biases.
Oh, of course, yeah, we have.
Editors have no biases.
Yeah,
That's-
no, but
and we are perfectly rational human beings, but we have to get to lunch, otherwise I'll become less rational. So thank you all for your attention and your good questions.